Today, we're really digging into a fascinating slice of World War II history. It's one of those stories that often gets overlooked, maybe just a footnote, but it had, well, a pretty profound impact on the world we live in now.
Absolutely. It's essential, really, if you want to understand how post-war Europe, especially West Germany, got rebuilt.
So, our mission today is to explore the sources around this surprising journey, this transformation of thousands of German prisoners of war, POWs, who were held right here in the United States during the war.
Yeah, we're talking about a situation where the enemy, captured soldiers ended up getting this kind of unexpected masterclass in democracy. The very system they'd been taught really hammered into them to despise.
It's not your typical war story about battles and strategy, is it?
Not at all. This is more about the quiet power of example, how showing someone a different way can be more effective than just telling them they're wrong.
Okay, let's set the scene a bit. It's 1943. Things are starting to turn in the war, though it's far from over.
Right, the tide is shifting. Hitler's armies are facing major setbacks.
And significantly, the Afrika Korps Rommel's legendary desert fighters, some of the most fiercely loyal soldiers in the German army, they've collapsed in North Africa.
Battle-hardened guys. And thousands of them are captured by the Allies. These aren't just random conscripts. Many are true believers in the Nazi ideology.
And their mindset at this point is crucial, isn't it? What were they expecting?
Well, years of Goebbels' propaganda had painted America as this chaotic, decadent place, morally bankrupt, racially impure, riddled with infighting.
And economically weak, right, soft, unable to really sustain a major war effort.
Exactly. So they genuinely expected to be shipped to a country that was, struggling, maybe even desperate, barely holding things together.
But that's not what happened. They get loaded onto transport ships.
And instead of ending up in some grim camp in, say, Britain or somewhere else in Europe, they're sent across the Atlantic.
All the way to the U.S. And that journey itself, that transatlantic crossing, that's kind of the first key piece of this transformation puzzle, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. Think about it. You're completely removed from the war zone, from the psychological shadow of the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
Even from the immediate control of your own officers within the POW structure.
And you're dropped right into the heart of the enemy's home front, the so-called arsenal of democracy.
And what they encountered there, it wasn't chaos. It was this staggering display of industrial power combined with, surprisingly, humane treatment. And that combination, that's what started to quietly, powerfully change minds.
And ultimately change the course of post-war Germany.
Yeah, the physical distance was vital. It created this sort of vacuum, a space where new ideas, things they were actually seeing with their own eyes, could start to take root.
Because if they'd stayed in Europe,
much harder. They'd still feel connected to the Reich, maybe still have hardcore Nazi elements maintaining control in the camps, being shipped thousands of miles away to the enemy's homeland. That made the strength, the reality of the Allied power, totally undeniable, visceral even.
Right, and that undeniable reality, it hit them pretty much the moment they arrived and started moving inland to these camps. Our sources, the diaries, the letters, they're full of just sheer astonishment.
Utter shock. Remember, they've been told constantly that America was practically running on empty. Resource-starved, people unwilling to sacrifice.
That the whole war effort was basically a bluff, built on fumes.
And that belief was grounded in their own reality back home, wasn't it? By 1943, Germany was feeling the pinch severely.
Rationing everywhere. Food, fuel, clothes, everything was tight.
Cities were being bombed regularly, constant blackouts. The entire society was geared towards this grinding, desperate war economy. Just survival, really.
Okay, so these soldiers, still in their Afrika Korps uniforms, get off the ships, they're put on trains. What do they actually see as they travel across America?
It must have felt like psychological warfare in itself. The contrast was so stark. They saw abundance, just mind-boggling abundance.
Instead of blackouts.
Cities glowing with light, even with a war on. They traveled through vast stretches of farmland, completely untouched by fighting, rich crops as far as the eye could see.
And the factories.
Rainless factories, passing by these huge industrial complexes running 24/7, smoke pouring from stacks, non-stop activity.
I think that word you used earlier, untouched, is key here. They were used to seeing destruction, or the constant threat of it.
Right. Infrastructure crumbling under Allied bombing.
So to travel for miles and miles through a country technically at war and see everything intact, humming along, it just pulled the rug out from under the Nazi narrative, didn't it?
Completely. That display of industrial power was maybe the first biggest crack in the foundation of their belief system.
It attacks that core idea of American weakness.
Exactly. And this is where that idea of the power of motion really hits home. They started to realize, okay, we're not just fighting an army, we're up against an entire industrial civilization.
This civilization that seemed to be operating on a completely different level.
Their own ideology, the Nazi system, preached that totalitarian control, centralized planning, that was the key to superior production. That was supposed to be the strength that would crush the inefficient democracies.
But what they saw here suggested the opposite, didn't it?
It really did. They saw that somehow this system, based on, well, economic freedom, maybe even a bit of that chaos they were taught about, was generating this seemingly limitless capacity, decentralized power, achieving incredible results.
We should probably put a number on that just to grasp the scale. The sources mention aircraft production.
Yeah, the B-24 Liberator statistic is just staggering. Think about it, a huge 4-engine heavy bomber, a complex piece of machinery.
How often were they being produced?
At the peak, one B-24 was rolling off the assembly line every 63 minutes.
Every 63 minutes.
Just think about that. An entire massive warplane built in less time than it takes to watch a movie today.
That's almost impossible to comprehend, especially from their perspective.
Absolutely. It just wouldn't compute with their experience of German war production.
Mm.
German industry under Speer was efficient in many ways, sure, but it was constantly battling shortages, fuel, raw materials, manpower, and crucially, relentless Allied bombing disrupting everything.
If the Germans managed to build a few advanced fighters, it was a major achievement.
Right. Meanwhile, the U.S. is churning out fleets of heavy bombers while also supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. It was a different dimension of industrial output.
That statistic alone must have been terrifying for them. A direct, irrefutable counter-argument to everything they believed about economic systems and national strength.
Precisely. And we see that reflected in their writings. There's that quote from a POW diary. It sums it up so well.
Which one is that?
It goes something like, "We were told America was struggling, but here, everything moved like clockwork. We could see power in motion."
Power in motion. That captures it perfectly. That raw, visible, undeniable strength.
And in that moment of realization, you could argue, the war was intellectually lost for them. If your ideology can't actually deliver the material goods needed to back up its claims, well, then the ideology itself is fundamentally flawed, isn't it?
They saw the engine behind the Allied war machine wasn't some temporary fluke, it was the American economy itself.
Huh?
The railways, the oil fields, the sheer scale of resources, untouched.
They realized the war wasn't just being decided on the battlefields in Europe or Africa. It was being won on factory floors in places like Detroit, Wichita, Los Angeles. It was an economic war, and they were staring right at the winner side of the ledger.
But okay, that's the initial shock. Seeing the factories, the abundance. Did that feeling last? I mean, if they were then thrown into brutal prison camps, wouldn't that just reinforce the idea that America was powerful, sure, but also ruthless? Maybe even confirm some of the propaganda?
That's a really important question. And it leads us straight into the next phase of their experience. Because the transformation wasn't just about what they saw outside the camps. It was very much about the reality inside them.
Yeah.
The conditions inside were the next big surprise. But first, let's just appreciate the scale of this whole POW program. It wasn't small.
Not at all. Between 43 and 46, the U.S. government set up and ran over 500 POW camps.
500. Think about that, scattered across 46 states.
The logistics alone are just staggering. Housing, feeding, guarding, managing hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers.
And the locations. They were everywhere. Down south in Texas and Alabama, where they often ended up working on farms because of labor shortages.
Agriculture was huge.
All the way up to the Midwest, Wisconsin, places like that. Even out west in California. These camps became part of the local landscape in many areas.
Okay, so they're in these camps. What was the second big shock for them after seeing American industry?
The conditions. The treatment. It directly contradicted the narrative they expected. These were not the kind of brutal, dehumanizing camps common in wartime Europe, certainly not like the ones the Nazis themselves were running.
Why not? What was the key difference?
The adherence to international law. The U.S. camps, crucially, operated under the rules of the Geneva Convention.
Even for soldiers of an enemy regime that often flagrantly disregarded those same rules.
Yes, and that commitment, that sticking to the rules, even when dealing with the enemy, was itself a powerful, if subtle, ideological message. It was another thing the prisoners just couldn't easily reconcile with the barbaric enemy image they'd been fed.
So what did adhering to the Geneva Convention actually mean for the average German POW day to day? It wasn't just bare minimum survival, was it?
No, definitely not. In fact, conditions were often significantly better than what civilians, even their own families, were experiencing back in bombed-out Germany by late 44 or 45.
Like,
Well, fair food rations, guaranteed medical care, which is a big deal. They were required to work, often on farms or in non-war-related industries locally.
and they got paid for that work.
Yes, about 75 cents a day, which they could actually spend at the camp's post-exchange, the PX, on small things like cigarettes, candy, maybe some toiletries, little bits of normalcy.
Okay, so basic needs met, fair treatment. But it went beyond that, didn't it? The sources talk about other resources.
It did. And this is where you start to see the seeds of that subtle re-education process being sown, almost unintentionally at first. There were provisions for intellectual and personal life.
Not just keeping them busy, but actually engaging their minds.
Exactly. Many camps developed small libraries. And these weren't just filled with propaganda. They often had classic German literature, Goethe, Schiller, alongside history, philosophy books.
So they could read authors revered in their own culture, but within an American prison camp.
Creates a bit of cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah.
And they were encouraged to organize cultural activities themselves. Some camps had prisoner-run orchestras playing Beethoven, Wagner, music the Nazis had tried to co-opt, now being performed freely by POWs in America.
Wow. What else?
They set up lecture series, language classes, particularly English, obviously even sports leagues. Soccer was huge, naturally.
So these activities weren't just killing time, they were allowing for individual expression, intellectual curiosity, things that had likely been suppressed under the rigid conformity of Nazism.
Precisely. It started to reawaken a sense of individuality, of critical thought that the totalitarian system had tried to stamp out.
Now, this interaction with the local American population, that seems like a really crucial and maybe unexpected part of this. How did that start? There must have been suspicion, even fear from the locals initially.
Oh, absolutely. Deep suspicion. American war propaganda had painted German soldiers, especially the SS, but also the Wehrmacht, as ruthless killers. So having hundreds or thousands of them suddenly camped nearby, people were nervous.
Understandably. So what changed?
Necessity, mostly.
Yeah.
The war effort created huge labor shortages, especially in farming. All the local men were away fighting.
So farmers needed help.
Desperately. Planting, harvesting, crops were rotting in the fields in some places. So over time, particularly in rural areas, arrangements were made. Local farmers could essentially hire POWs from the nearby camp.
How did that work? The farmers paid the prisoners directly.
Not quite. Usually the farmer paid the U.S. government a standard wage for the labor, and the government then paid the POWs their smaller allowance. That's 75 cents a day.
Ah, okay. But this created direct contact, didn't it? Outside the wire in a non-military setting.
Exactly. This wasn't some official policy designed for interaction. It was just practical, small-town America figuring out how to get the work done. And it put German soldiers and American civilians face-to-face, working together.
And that's where the human connection started.
That's what the sources strongly suggest. It began to break down the stereotypes on both sides. As one account put it, they began to see each other as people, not enemies.
Simple human interaction. Sharing a task, maybe a quick word.
Or maybe sharing a meal break. There are stories of farm wives offering POWs working in their fields a cold drink or a piece of pie. German soldiers hearing American kids playing nearby. Just normal life unfolding around them.
And that must have directly contradicted the dehumanizing propaganda they'd absorbed for years. Seeing ordinary Americans as just ordinary people.
It chipped away at that wall of hatred and fear, bit by bit.
Okay, but I have to push back on this a little. While they're seeing this humane treatment, this abundance, they're also in America during the 1940s. They must have seen the deep contradictions, particularly around race, right?
Absolutely. That's a critical point, and we can't gloss over it.
Yeah.
They definitely saw American racism firsthand, especially in the southern camps.
The sources mention them seeing black and white Americans working together in factories, which would have confused their Nazi racial ideas. But they also would have seen Jim Crow segregation.
Oh, unquestionably. They saw segregated facilities in towns, separate water fountains, waiting rooms. They saw black soldiers in U.S. Army uniforms, sometimes serving on the bases near their camps, but often in segregated units. Some accounts even mention the irony of black American guards overseeing white German prisoners.
So how did they process that? Wouldn't seeing that kind of blatant inequality enforced by the state maybe reinforce some of their own regime's ideas about racial hierarchy, or at least make them question American ideals?
It definitely caused confusion and discussion among them. Their diaries and letters mention this paradox, a nation fighting fascism abroad while practicing segregation at home. It was noted as a major inconsistency, a hypocrisy even.
So it didn't derail the overall transformation.
It seems for the majority it didn't derail the main impact. While they recognized the contradiction, the overwhelming factors, the sheer economic power they witnessed, the generally fair treatment they personally received under the Geneva Convention, the fact that America was clearly winning the war, these things seemed to carry more weight in dismantling their core Nazi beliefs.
So the success and the fairness they experienced sort of overshadowed the societal flaws they observed.
It appears so for many. They might have seen the flaws, but they couldn't deny the system's overall effectiveness and the relative freedom and prosperity it produced, even with those deep-seated problems. The shock of abundance and the unexpected personal decency they encountered often seemed to be the more powerful forces acting on their worldview at that moment.
Okay, so this daily exposure, the wealth, the relative freedom, the generally humane treatment, even seeing those societal contradictions, this all starts to work on them. It wasn't a formal re-education program, not yet anyway, but it was effectively doing the job.
Right. It was the slow, steady pressure of reality dismantling the artificial structure of Nazi ideology they carried in their heads.
And let's really focus on how the visual evidence attacked those core Nazi tenets. You mentioned race, but also gender roles.
Exactly. Nazism was built on rigid hierarchies. Aryan supremacy, biological determinism, women confined to kinder, Kirche children, kitchen, church.
So what did they see in America that blew that up?
Well, when they went out on work details, particularly in factories contributing to the war effort indirectly, they saw black and white Americans working together. Maybe not always perfectly integrated, but collaborating in ways that directly contradicted the strict racial separation dogma of the Third Reich. It simply didn't compute with their worldview.
And the women, the Kirche idea.
Completely shattered. They saw American women everywhere doing men's work. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster, she was real. They saw women operating heavy machinery in those factories.
The very factories building the tanks and planes, defeating their army.
Precisely. They saw women running farms, managing businesses, taking on complex roles while the men were fighting overseas. This image of competent, empowered women contributing directly to the nation's strength was a powerful visual argument against the Nazi ideal of women confined to the domestic sphere.
It showed that America's strength came partly from utilizing all its people's talents.
Right. Regardless of gender, and often, despite the racial barriers, there was a mobilization of talent that Nazi ideology, with its rigid exclusions, simply couldn't match.
So for many of these prisoners, this wasn't just interesting. It was probably their first real, tangible experience of seeing a democracy function, warts and all. Not just reading about it, but living adjacent to it.
Seeing it work. Seeing how a society that allowed for more freedom, more diversity, more flexibility could also generate incredible power and cohesion, at least enough to win a world war.
And this leads directly to that internal intellectual struggle you mentioned, the one we see in their diaries. How could this possibly work?
That's the core crisis. They'd been relentlessly taught that democracy was weak, inefficient, decadent. That strength came from authoritarian control, from unity imposed from the top down.
But military strength was the ultimate measure for them, wasn't it?
It was the language they understood: power, efficiency, victory. And America was demonstrating all three on an unbelievable scale.
Let's bring back those quotes because they really nail this ideological turning point. The first one: we were taught that democracy is weak, but here, democracy builds tanks.
It's so concise, isn't it? It connects the political system directly to the military outcome they could see all around them. If democracy delivers overwhelming military power, then the premise, democracy is weak, has to be wrong. Simple, brutal logic from their perspective.
And the second quote digs a bit deeper into the how. I began to wonder, how could such a free people be so strong?
That question.
Yeah.
That's the sound of an ideology cracking. It's the shift from certainty to doubt to genuine inquiry. How can freedom, which we were told leads to chaos and weakness, actually be the source of this incredible strength?
It's the ultimate paradox they had to confront. They were being defeated by the very system they were programmed to believe was inherently inferior.
And the conclusion became inescapable for many. Maybe strength comes from freedom, maybe innovation, economic dynamism, the ability to mobilize a willing population. Maybe those things flourish because of liberty, not in spite of it.
And the way this realization happened, it wasn't forced on them, was it? That seems key.
Absolutely critical. This wasn't some aggressive propaganda campaign initially. No one was frog-marching them into lecture halls demanding they renounce Hitler, at least not in the early
It
stages.
was more subtle, demonstrative.
Exactly. It relied on observation, on lived experience, on the undeniable evidence of their own senses. And because they arrived at these conclusions themselves based on what they saw and experienced, that's why it stuck.
Which makes it, as you said, maybe one of the most successful yet quietest re-education efforts in history.
Because genuine belief change rarely comes from coercion. It comes from within, from confronting reality and finding your old explanations wanting.
The sources really emphasize that point. No amount of lecturing could have matched the impact of just seeing a prosperous, functioning, powerful society that was decisively winning the war. They became eyewitnesses to democracy's effectiveness, even while seeing its flaws.
Right. And once that foundation of doubt and curiosity was laid by their own observations, the U.S. authorities did start to introduce more structured elements. They recognized that the initial shock had made many of these men receptive to new ideas.
So this is where it shifts from just passive observation to something more active.
Exactly. It moves from that kind of accidental re-education through exposure to a more deliberate but still voluntary educational program. This is the invitation part.
Okay, so what did that involve? The camps started offering actual classes.
Yes. Specific classes designed to fill the gaps left by Nazi ideology and offer alternatives. They weren't just make work, they had real academic content.
What kind of subjects?
Things like history, American history, world history from a non-Nazi perspective, civics, how does the American system of government actually work, separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, the role of free press, and crucially, English language classes became very popular.
So equipping them with the intellectual tools to understand and critique fascism and to understand democracy.
That was the goal. Discussing concepts like human rights, the rule of law, the inherent dangers of dictatorship, comparing systems.
Who taught these classes? Were they military personnel?
Interestingly, no, not usually. They often brought in local civilians, college professors from nearby universities, high school teachers, sometimes even local clergy or community leaders.
So it wasn't military propaganda officers delivering lectures.
No, it was presented more as academic learning, often encouraging discussion and critical thinking, which again was a stark contrast to the Nazi method.
How so?
The Nazi system gave you the answers, the dogma, and demanded unquestioning belief and obedience. This American approach, at its best, offered information, raised questions, and encouraged the POWs to engage critically with the material.
And the most important part, according to the sources, was that participation was voluntary, right?
Crucial, absolutely crucial, as the quote suggests. It made all the difference.
Why was that voluntary aspect so powerful?
Think about their background. Under Nazism, political education was mandatory, relentless, inescapable. Here, a German soldier had to choose to use his limited free time to attend a class on American federalism or the history of democracy.
So it wasn't compliance, it was genuine interest.
Exactly. When someone, especially an educated soldier, trying to understand why his world collapsed, chooses to study an alternative system because he's genuinely seeking answers, that knowledge gets internalized in a way forced indoctrination never achieves. It becomes self-discovery, not just obeying the captor.
So this whole approach, this soft power, as we might call it today, it worked by invitation, not by force.
Precisely. And slowly, gradually, men who had once maybe literally worshipped Hitler started to develop a respect not just for America's power, but for the underlying values they were seeing and learning about. Yeah. Fairness, individual rights, the potential of a free society.
It was a different kind of victory being won, not on the battlefield, but in the camp classroom, the library, the informal discussions.
Yeah. And if you zoom out, it's a pretty profound lesson in how influence actually works, isn't it?
How so?
It shows that lasting change, real ideological shifts, often come not from dictating or demanding, but from demonstrating, from showing a better alternative in action.
The U.S. won these guys over, essentially, by living up to its own ideals, at least in terms of their treatment.
To a significant degree, yes.
Yeah.
By showing them a system that, despite its flaws, produced incredible results and adhered to principles like the Geneva Convention even towards its enemies. That universality, applying your rules even when it's hard, even to those who don't reciprocate. That's maybe the strongest demonstration of a principle's value. It showed the rules weren't just for show or for convenience.
Okay, so the war ends in 1945, VE Day. What happens to these hundreds of thousands of German POWs in America?
The next big phase begins. repatriation, sending them back home to Germany.
And they weren't the same men who arrived, were they?
Far from it. The sources describe many leaving, well, deeply changed, often grateful for the treatment they received, which contrasted sharply with what they knew awaited them in a ruined Germany. Some were apparently quite emotional about leaving the relative stability and safety of the camps.
But they faced a huge challenge going back.
Immense. They were returning to a country that was physically devastated by bombing, economically shattered, morally compromised by the horrors of the Nazi regime, and politically in chaos, occupied by the Allied powers.
A total wreck.
Pretty much. But crucially, they carried something inside them that most other Germans didn't have. A recent tangible experience of a functioning, prosperous, relatively free society.
They had seen an alternative model.
Exactly. They didn't just have the abstract idea of democracy, they had observed its practical application, its industrial strength, its legal framework in the U.S.
Yeah.
They carried back a potential blueprint, not for the thousand-year Reich, but for rebuilding Germany along democratic lines.
So how did that actually play out? Did these former POWs become, as the outline suggests, architects of a new Germany?
In many significant ways, yes. Their influence spread through various fields: law, politics, education, journalism. They brought back not just ideas, but credibility based on their unique experience.
Are there specific examples? People we can point to?
The most prominent example often cited is Walter Hallstein.
Okay, who was he?
Before the war, he was a respected law professor. He was captured, ended up as a POW, notably in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, which had a particularly strong educational program. He got deeply involved in the civics and legal studies offered there.
And what happened after he went back to Germany?
He immediately became a key figure in rebuilding West Germany's legal and academic institutions. He helped draft frameworks for the new democratic state. But his biggest impact came later.
Which was?
His experience observing American federalism, the way power was shared but coordinated, the sheer strength derived from that huge integrated economic system. It profoundly shaped his thinking about Europe's future. He became the first president of the Commission of the European Economic Community, the EEC, the direct forerunner of today's European Union. He served from 1958 to 1967.
Wow. So a direct line from a POW camp in Alabama to leading the early EU.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? His vision for an integrated, collaborative, democratic Europe, bound by treaties and economic partnership. Much of that was informed by seeing how a large, diverse, decentralized system like the U.S. could generate stability and prosperity. He saw you could build strength through cooperation, not just authoritarian command.
That's a powerful legacy right there. Was he an isolated case?
Not at all. Many others played vital roles. Perhaps less famous, but equally important. Former POWs became influential journalists committed to building a free press after years of Nazi control. They understood the importance of transparency and holding power accountable.
Others went into teaching.
Yes, becoming teachers and professors, dedicated to instilling critical thinking and democratic values in the post-war generation, consciously reversing the fascist indoctrination they themselves had experienced. They had a unique kind of moral authority.
Because they could say, look, we fought for that other system. We believed in it, and we saw firsthand why it failed and why this alternative works better.
Exactly. They weren't just adopting democracy because the Allied occupiers told them to. They were often embracing it from a place of deep personal conviction born from their time in the U.S. camps. They had seen the proof.
Okay, there's one more statistic that really seems to encapsulate the whole experience, the one about escape attempts.
Ah, yes. It's truly remarkable. Out of the nearly 400,000 German POWs held in the U.S. during those years,
How many tried to escape?
only about 0.6%. Less than 1% ever even attempted it.
Less than 1%. That seems incredibly low for hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers held captive for years. Why? They weren't all happy campers, surely.
No, conditions varied, and it was still captivity. But think about what escape meant. Where would they go? Back to fight for a losing, maybe already lost cause. Back to an ideology many were realizing was based on lies.
So the low escape rate wasn't just about fences and guards.
The sources suggest it was much more profound than that. For many, the desire to escape just wasn't there, because in a strange way, they had already found a different kind of freedom inside the camps.
Freedom from what?
Freedom from the mental prison of Nazi ideology. Freedom to think, to learn, to observe reality without the filter of propaganda. As one historian put it, they didn't need to escape the nation. They had escaped the idea.
So they chose overwhelmingly to stay, observe, learn, and wait for repatriation.
Yes, wait to go back and participate in building something new in Germany using the insights they'd gained. They chose essentially conversion over conflict in that context. Hashtag tag outro. So when we take this deep dive, what we're really seeing is this hidden layer of the Allied victory in World War II. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about winning the argument, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was an ideological victory as much as a military one. Let's just quickly recap that journey we've traced.
Okay.
We started with these fiercely loyal German soldiers, mostly from the Africa Corps, arriving in the U.S. expecting weakness and finding overwhelming strength.
Right, the shock of industry first.
Then, the shock of humane treatment, the adherence to the Geneva Convention, life inside the camps that wasn't brutal but offered opportunities to learn and think,
The power of example, contradicting their propaganda.
which led to this quiet internal collapse of their Nazi worldview, especially when they saw American society functioning, flaws and all, and compared it to what they knew.
That cognitive dissonance, the realization that freedom could equal strength.
And finally, the voluntary education programs that gave them the tools to understand democracy, leading many to return home not as bitter enemies, but as potential allies, ready to help build a new democratic Germany. Some even becoming key architects of post-war Europe.
From enemy soldiers to foundational figures, it's quite a trajectory.
So the core lesson here, it seems, it's really about that power of example you mentioned at the start.
I think so. America, in this instance, defeated Nazism not just with its military might, but by demonstrating the practical power and, yes, the moral strength that can come from democratic ideals, fairness, adherence to law, belief in humanity, even when dealing with your enemies.
It showed that a free society, a liberal society, could actually be the strongest, most resilient kind of society.
And by choosing largely to show mercy instead of just seeking vengeance, by sticking to its own legal standards, America didn't just win the war against these men, it fundamentally changed them. It turned former enemies into future partners.
That quiet diplomatic and ideological victory might be one of the most important, yet least celebrated outcomes of the war, laying groundwork for the stable Western Europe that followed.
Absolutely. And maybe in that whole story, that often overlooked transformation, lies one of the truly great, if quietest, victories of the entire conflict.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on.
Yeah, but reflecting on this history makes you wonder, doesn't it? When facing adversarial ideologies or belief systems today, maybe history offers a lesson. Sometimes, perhaps the most potent weapon isn't coercion or confrontation, but simply the undeniable lived reality of a successful, free society functioning according to its own best principles. Maybe the truth of example is the most powerful counterargument there is.